Welcome back to Dino's Garage for the YZF750R. I was just telling you where I am now with things. So, valve clearances. You can see where I am with this at the moment. I've pretty much stripped everything. You're almost now down to basically the engine in the frame. The exhaust is obviously on this, but this is kind of where you need to get to. You could do the valve clearances without taking the carbs off, but as you can see, when you do take the carbs off, you get all of this clearance. Now, I don't know whether or not this is the case with all of these bikes as standard, but to take the carbs off, you obviously have the rubber sleeves, if you like, that attach to the inlets and obviously attach to the underside of the carbs. Now the screws for those face this way, and I don't know whether that's standard or whether someone's rotated them the wrong way, but so to undo these screws, you've got the carbs on top so you can't really see the screws. You have to wear a head torch like I do to really see what's going in there and how to get a screwdriver in there. And they're not Phillips heads, they're little Allen key headed, so be prepared for that. So if you think you're trying to get a screwdriver in there, nothing's working, it's because they're Allen headed. And I found I could just about get my screwdriver, which is a ratchet type screwdriver, in at an angle, find the screw and undo it. Now, as with everything on this bike, I pre-squirted oil and WD-40 and penetrating fluid over everything, knowing that eventually I'm going to come to undo these things and it'll be a lot easier. Always a good thing to do, because these screws were actually very easy to undo once I got an Allen key in there. Now, 3 of them are easy, but this particular one here was quite tricky, just coming in at the angle. My screwdriver is slightly too long, so it was up against here and I could not get the angle to get into the screw. It was about sort of that angle going across into the frame here. Luckily I did have another Allen key, like a long reach T-bar thing, so that went in there. I just about could see the head of the thing ish, and got it in and undid it. Once I did that, wiggled about, the rubbers pulled off the inlets quite easy, so yeah, the carbs came off fairly easy. And then once you do that, it gives you all this clearance space to check the valves. Now, another thing I'm very confused about, in the proper workshop manual, when I say proper, not a Haynes, but the actual workshop manual, if you're working in a garage or something, they mention taking a 75mm bolt, an 8mm bolt, and then a sleeve of 12mm external diameter. You wind it into here, so that bolt obviously tightens up clockwise, and then what you're meant to do is turn the engine anti-clockwise, and guess what, the moment you turn that bolt anti-clockwise, the bolt undoes. So I don't get it. I don't get why the sleeve would make a difference, because it doesn't. There's basically this sort of tapered part, and then beyond that is the threaded part, but the moment you try to turn the engine anti-clockwise, the bolt just undoes, which you'd expect it to. I just don't get it. And I would understand if you were using this little pinhole here somehow. So what you'd have to do is have like a bolt that goes through with some sort of washer and pin, and then when you do the bolt up, the pin locks into here, and then maybe as you undo the bolt, because you go to undo it, the pin's locked into this position, it wouldn't rotate, if you know what I mean. You have to have the washer and a pin, tighten the bolt down onto that washer so the pin locates, but it doesn't mention that in the manual. I have no idea what that hole's for. It is like there is some special tool, but it doesn't explain that in the manual, and that is a proper workshop manual. So I gave up trying to use that. You need to use that window. That window there gives you your markers. You can't really see, sorry, but no, that's not really helping you much, but there you go, you can just about see the markers there now. There's that little sort of metal arrow to the left, and then what it does is it lines up. There you go. So at the moment, with that marker like that, when you look at these here, you've got cylinders 1, 2, 3, 4, and don't forget this is a Genesis engine, so you have 5 valves per cylinder. So you've got 3 inlets and then 2 outlets or exhaust valves. So you've got these 3 here, 1, 2, 3, pointing towards me, and then the exhaust will be pointing that way towards the front wheel. So you know that these are in position for you to do the feeler gauge, because A, you got the marker here in the right place, and then B, you've got the back end of the lobe, so you've got the rounded back end, and then the tapered sort of narrowest point always pointing outward of the engine. So outward there, if you look at the front, you can see the 2 exhaust valves there, and so as you rotate this anti-clockwise, or in my case I've got the wheel up on a stand and I rotate the wheel backwards, turning the engine anti-clockwise, the marker will change, and what you kind of do is look for the change in the lobes, look for the change in the cam lobes, and you'll begin to see which one's about to go into position, and then verify that using the marker. So you either have a little slash and a T to tell you it's top dead center, or you have this, in which case like this, where you have the little sort of mark and a cutout, and that will show you as you turn through sort of 180 degrees and 360 and continue round. You'll see the other lobes move into position, and then you're ready to get your feeler gauges in. Now I've done all of that last night, and in my case the exhaust valves are not too bad. Most are within tolerance, but the inlets are very much closed to the point where I can't even get a 0.05 feeler gauge into the inlets, and they are meant to be a minimum of 0.11 up to 0.20, so you got that 0.09 tolerance. Well, I'm not even getting a feeler gauge in which is 0.05, and really once you get down to 0.05 it's so thin you can't really push it in as such, so there must be down to 0.04, 0.03, something like that. So I'm going to have to basically order shims. So today I'm going to be taking the cam chain tensioner out, which is down in here. You can see it, it's try to show you without creating shadows. That's the cam chain tensioner in the centre of the camera there, and that's the bolt coming out. So that's it there. So it is accessible. Like I say, you need to get as you can see, you wouldn't be able to do this with your carbs on. You wouldn't be able to gain access to that cam chain tensioner. So that has to come off. Then basically take the slide carrier off the cam chain here, put a bit of wire through and wire it up into something up here, so you don't accidentally drop the cam chain down into the bottom part of the crank, because once you take obviously your cams out, there's nothing to stop that chain dropping down. So it's very important to put a bit of wire up through and retain that up here, so it's got some tension and it's out the way. So then I will take both cams out, making very sure that I put these in a relative position on a sheet of paper, so I know exactly where they've come from, along with the bolts. Leave the bolts in the holes. Then I'm basically removing the buckets, and then obviously the little shims underneath. Then I'll be taking note of what each shim number is, and then obviously looking at the difference between what I need in tolerance and what currently exists. A little bit hard to explain, but you'll get the gist of it as I go, or if you look at other YouTube videos, you'll see people doing valves and shims, and quite well explained as they take each one out. So that's where I am with it. So that's what I'm going to be doing this morning, is, like I say, removing the cam chain tensioner, removing the stuff off the top of these cams, setting them out, marking out so I don't lose things or get things mixed up, and I know exactly where they've come from, because it's very, very important that everything goes back in exactly the same place that it come from. You can't mix these up and sort of take one off of one and put it somewhere else, because it's very important you never do that. And then I'll be noting all the shims, and then crack on with ordering the shims and put it all back together again when the new shims come. Then you've got to check the valve clearances again and hope they're within tolerance. Then you can get back to sort of putting everything back together again. The other thing to do is to make sure that when you do undo all of the bolts across here, see, at the moment there's slack in that chain, that cam chain. The reason for that is that none of the lobes are pushing down onto the valve springs and in effect pushing the cams up and causing a lot of tension on this chain. So you need to turn the wheel or turn the engine anti-clockwise to get it to a position where none of the lobes are in their highest point, and so they're not pushing down and causing tension to come back onto here. So at the moment, cylinder number 3 are beginning to go into that position but aren't yet, so there isn't a lot of tension in that chain. If you don't do that, then what will happen is it will be an absolute pain to try and you'll find you undo the bolts and the cams almost sort of pop off against the tension, but when you come to try and put them back in, it will be an absolute nightmare, because you're trying to push down against the springs of the valves in effect. So yeah, make sure that you release any tension on the cams and the chain before you undo those bolts and go to take the cams out. So there you go, there are all of the shims that I've written down into the corresponding valve positions, just so you can see basically, for those of you that have never sort of done this, that's the bucket and that's the shim. The shim sits in the inner part of the bucket on that underside there. It just sort of sticks into place with a bit of grease, and then that bucket goes down onto the top of the valve guide, and then your cam basically pushes down onto that. So it's the shim that sets that bucket up or down by increments of, sort of 0.0 millimeters. This particular shim has 81 written on it, so that is 1.81 millimeters. Some of these shims, interestingly, on all the external exhaust valves, I can read all the numbers clearly, and on a lot of the intake valves, some of them are clear, some of them weren't. So just to double check where I thought it might have been, 80 or 86 or something, I've used my digital micrometer here just to double check and verify, and it verifies that. Just to also a little tip as well, if you're not sure on the calibration of this and whether it's accurate or not, use a feeler gauge which has the thickness written on it, and then measure your feeler gauge with these, zero it out, get a reading, which is what I did with a couple of different feeler gauge thicknesses. Then I knew that this was working pretty accurately within sort of 0.01 of a millimeter. It was pretty accurate. So there we are, with a bit of prints in the background, sorry about that. Those are the shim sizes taken off of all of the shims that I've now got on here. And so using what I've already measured with a feeler gauge, I will begin to take these readings, knowing what I need to achieve within tolerance. I will then replace with a different shim to get to within that tolerance. Right, so here we are. I've measured all the shims, put all the details down, and I'll explain how I've done this and what I've done now, just to give you an idea of basically how to calculate replacement shims when doing your valve clearance checks. So as you can see, Here we have the exhaust valves, and here we have the inlet valves, and as you'll see, you've got 1 and 2, because on a Genesis engine, as explained before, you have 2 exhaust valves and 3 inlet valves. So I've marked 1, 2 all the way along, so in total we have the 20 valves. So I'll just explain what I've done here. So where you have exhaust valve number 1 there, the measured size with the feeler gauge was 0.18. The shim inside was 1.7 mil. Now ideally we need to get a shim size of around 1.77.
Hold it right there.
Now I'll explain that. So there we have it. Hopefully I've explained that clearly. Like I say, thank you very much for watching. Choked.